Worth highlighting too, of course, that we've got the Code of Conduct Standards for AFAs, which were revised again this year, and which crucially put as their first standard the requirement to put the client's interests first and to act with integrity. As I always say, particularly as a former lawyer myself, you can nitpick those words, all of us can do that. But I think as a statement of principle for anyone in financial services, I mean anyone in financial services, I think it's a very important place to start. And in some other jurisdictions where you have seen trust in the financial services sector erode to what I would describe as a crisis point, I think it's that exact lack of being able to demonstrate that principle that has been an issue. I'd like to think also that we've seen over that period not only the establishment of the FMA, but the positioning of the FMA as an active and engaged regulator. As you know, we review practices in this sector on a regulated, systematic basis, and we're doing our best to be as transparent as we can be about what we find, so that lessons can be learned and that people can understand our expectations for the sector. So in terms of some observations then and what we have seen to date, I would say that generally speaking, we see a very high recognition amongst financial advisors that we, and by we I mean all of us, I mean advisors, the big providers, the regulators, have to do better to make sure that the value proposition of quality advice in New Zealand is fully understood by New Zealand investors. It's clear to us there's considerable good intent and goodwill in the sector to aim for that objective. But we do still see, which is perhaps not surprising given the relatively early stage of regulation for some firms and some individuals, we still see a high degree of variability in the quality of compliance. We see some very good compliance. We see some very well-meaning efforts that don't quite get to where we'd like people to get, but are genuinely making those efforts. And we still see some areas where we don't think the level of compliance or the level of effort to get to compliance is yet acceptable. We have recently noted, for instance, in our published monitoring report on AFAs, instances where we saw what we felt was a lack of attention to Standard 7, the scope of service statements, Standard 8, documenting the client's financial needs and goals, and Standard 9 in particular, making the benefits and risks of the proposed course of action explicit to clients, particularly in relation to Category 1 products. In the QFEs, we have stated publicly our concern about the churning of clients, including KiwiSaver clients, where we see in too many instances no demonstration of a concrete benefit to the client in switching, and in many cases insufficient information provided to the client as to why they should consider switching. In the QFE sector, we see the same issues we've seen amongst AFAs around being clear on the scope of the services provided and documenting what the client is trying to get out of the relationship. We have also raised concerns publicly about the degree to which QFEs report breaches to us, whether that's amongst their own advisors, their own agents or employees, nominated representatives. We have seen lower reporting in that space than we would have anticipated. That may be partly because we have to build trust so that people know where they report things that have gone wrong, that we dealt with in a proportionate way, but we would like to see more of that reporting. We have seen enormous efforts in the sector as a whole since the pre-Financial Advisor Act days, and it's always worth reminding people of just what a significant period of change that all of us have been through, whether it's you, whether it's the regulators, whether it's the policy setters. But we still feel for the sector there's a fair way to go to get what we would see as systematic regulatory results that we would be looking for. So to look ahead, what might we see in the next 4 to 5 years? Well, notwithstanding my remarks about leaving some of the FAA process and objectives to Ian, that review, I think, is critical. It gives all of us, whether that's the advisors, the product providers, the regulators, and the consumers of financial services, it gives us all the opportunity to stop and ask what's working, what isn't working, and are we all clear on the fact that we're trying to get to the same place. A couple of points to call out, which won't surprise any of you. We accept that the three-way split between AFAs, QFEs and RFAs has to be on the table as part of that review. It adds complexity to the overall situation, both from your perspective, our perspective, and I think more critically, the perspective of users and potential users of financial advice. And obviously it does add cost burdens in some parts of the sector, which arguably are not proportionate. You throw in DIMS on top of that, if you want to talk about complexity, that significantly compounded the issue of the understanding of the sector from the outside. Just like Australia, we will have to consider whether there should be mandatory tertiary qualifications as an entry-level requirement for the sector, or at least parts of the sector, beyond those that are already required. It looks like Australia is going to go that way. They've gone backwards and forwards, particularly with the change of government on some of what was originally proposed for the financial advice sector. But it does look as if they're going to land on degree-level entry requirements. And clearly, that's something we need to think about, not least because in order to achieve any sort of trans-Tasman reciprocity, we can't have a sector that's got different standards, significantly different standards than Australia. And on that point, I would like to remind people that the competence standards that went into the code were always intended to be a starting point for the development of a profession. They were not intended to be the destination. And the views of the FMA are that with the right degree of grandfathering and the right degree of phasing in, that is an area that the industry, if I can call it that, and the regulators should be looking very hard at. So I think some of those points will be critical baselines in the review of the Act. But our hope at the FMA is that it will be a comprehensive review and that no stone will be left unturned, which doesn't mean, of course, that absolutely everything has to change. We would like to take the opportunity to take a proper step back and look at it in a slightly different environment than that which existed when it was put in place, and indeed in the couple of years that immediately followed. Notably, for us at the FMA, one of the big conversations we're having and trying to work out how to address is that we don't feel that we yet understand fully what the consumers of financial services and the investors who either do or should perhaps be using financial advice, what it is that's driving them. And that's absolutely critical because clearly consumers and investors are a key part of the FMA's mandate. And I think in any review of the FMA, actually the starting point should be what is it that users understand, what is it they don't understand, what would make more people use financial advice, why aren't more people who we might think ought to at least be considering financial advice. Our surveys tell us they're just not. And so we really need to get on top of that. So one of our early priorities in the new year will be to make sure that between us, the industry associations, MD, and anyone else who wants to come to the table, we have started to develop a much better understanding of what the users think. In the sector generally, I think there are some structural issues that need to be addressed. Some of these sit more with us, some of them sit more with you. I think it's clear amongst the AFA population in particular that succession planning is a real topic. Our data shows that the majority of AFAs are over 50 years old, that the numbers of AFAs are declining, and that there are relatively small numbers under 40 in that sector, certainly less than 20%. So that seems to us as an issue. I think we as a regulator, as part of the FAA review, have to think about what our objectives are for the sector, and if it's not possible to attract enough good people into the sector, what is it that we as a regulator should do to address that? What is it that could be done more from a policy perspective? And I do appreciate that a lot of what you might call the compliance burden that the legislation imposes on you, that we impose on you in the way we interpret it. I do appreciate the FMA's views on higher entry-level standards all compound that particular issue. So I think it all needs to be in the mix. There's also the obvious issue which has been seen in New Zealand, I think has been seen in Australia and the UK, where you have seen significant regulatory efforts to rethink how the sector gets regulated. You've seen a real variance across the sector in terms of what the models are, who's providing what level of advice, and I don't think that's been properly dealt with, although again, my plea would be not to make it more complex. So I think we have a clearly defined group of AFAs who are either independently or in relatively small groups, often providing very highly personalised advice to a relatively small number of clients. Those advisors often don't have the benefits of the research and the other data that the big providers have, and they don't necessarily have access to the product supply that someone working for or with one of the big providers gets. But there is clearly a market for advisors who provide highly personalised advice. Sometimes as a regulator we need to remember that not everyone is trying to aspire to that, but we do have to make sure that whatever we do can accommodate those advisors, as well as advisors perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, or those working for the bigger firms on an employee or a time basis. Thirdly, remuneration. I think it would be remiss of me not to say something on that topic. Remuneration across the financial services industry is something that we're looking at hard. I think all regulators are looking at that hard, given some of the issues globally around mis-selling and poor advice. We need to look at remuneration and incentive structures to understand the impact they're having on the client's interests, whether that's a question of active prescription from the regulator, whether it's a question of better transparency and disclosure. I think that's a debate that should not be ducked, and I would stress that that is not in any way unique to the financial advisor sector. In fact, I think it's even more prevalent in what one might call the bigger end of town than it is in many other places. So better quality disclosure and remuneration might be the answer, it might be part of the answer. I'm pretty sure it's not all of the answer. Remuneration arrangements generally and conflicted conduct, clearly something the FMA with its focus on conduct needs to keep front of mind. So I know, given what I've said about the variety of business models in the sector, that this is not a question to which there's an easy answer. And the Australians have just spent the last 4 years grappling with it, and as far as I can tell, still haven't really come to a clear conclusion on what the right structure is. And it is remarkable that they've been looking at, if you like, their FAA review since 2010, and they've got to one end of the spectrum in terms of the proposals put to the industry, and they're in quite a different place at this point. And the new government has rowed back from a bunch of things. It has come to some degree of conclusion on advisory remuneration, and I think it's quite a bitter debate. But a lot of people in the industry in Australia are not happy with where it's landed. So I hesitate to say in front of the New Zealand audience that we can learn from Australians, but I'll perhaps phrase that to say we can learn from where they went wrong. In that context, obviously we would like to recognise the turmoil, the change that the sector has gone through, and try and avoid repeating that change and turmoil as much as we can, particularly as it relates to remuneration. But as I say, we do feel strongly that we need to focus on the interests of the consumers and the clients and make sure we understand what it is that they want. So not surprisingly, perhaps, there's some big questions that we know need to be answered. But let me just come back at the end to the point I made at the beginning, which is the FMA's view is that we want to reassure you that we do believe there's a place, an absolutely critical place, for quality financial advice in New Zealand. I would hazard a guess that if you roll 5 or 10 years forward and the number of people either building up significant amounts of KiwiSaver or indeed coming out of KiwiSaver and needing to get good advice on what they're going to do with those sums of money could radically transform the value proposition for the industry. And I think we all need to be ready for the longer term consequences of KiwiSaver and what it is. And I'd also like to say that as the regulator for financial services, we are absolutely committed to helping the sector grow and to provide what investors and clients need. committed to make sure that we understand, that you understand what investors want and where the current proposition is too complicated and they're just backing away. So that's a challenge for everybody, a challenge for us, a challenge for you, a challenge for the government. This is one of the early steps, I think, in meeting that challenge, getting the FAA review kicked off, making sure we thought thoroughly about what its objectives should be and how it should work. And I am confident that we'll come out of that process with much clearer reframing, if you like, of the objectives and the key components of the regulation of that sector. So as I say, our pleas to the Minister and to MD, both of which I think have been met with agreement, are that the review should be comprehensive and that in our opinion the guiding objective of where we land in the FAA review should be simplification. A simplification for you, a simplification for us, and as I've said a number of times in this speech, that simplification for those who either do use financial advice or ought to be using financial advice. So with that, I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Rob, and I don't see any burning questions coming out of there after Rob did say he's going to reduce the turmoil of the sector, so that's pleasing to hear. AFA numbers, I think we've got most of them here today, Rob. Turnout of 300, thanks for turning up. Next speaker, David Ireland, Chair of the Code Committee, will now address us. I see David's got a PowerPoint, which may be a bit difficult to view from over there, but I'm sure he will paint some amazing verbal pictures. David.
So with Rob having promised to reduce the turmoil, I promise I won't provide the opposite end of the spectrum of trying to increase the turmoil, but we'll see how we go. Thanks for the introduction, Fred, thanks all for coming here. And one of the things I've found quite uplifting through this whole process of the Code Committee is just the willingness of the advisory industry to engage in this process. I'd like to think we've got a better outcome as a consequence of that engagement. Which will actually title this presentation sort of the long and winding road, so picking up on the Beatles song there. Unfortunately, we have still got a long way to go, so just encourage you to maintain that engagement because if we don't engage, especially through the FAA review coming up, then you may find that what we end up with is not what we would like it to be. We have seen from past experience that actually the engagement does make a difference, does matter, does actually influence outcomes. Like the Code Committee has been a good example of that, actually responding to feedback that we have got and sort of changing tack on some things. For this session I was asked to provide a Code Committee perspective, so really just explain to the group how we fit into things. I recognise there's a little bit of confusion there as to how all the moving parts work. We have got a diagram, a couple of slides into this that tries to explain all those moving parts. Trying to clarify, I guess, how the FAA works, what the influences are in driving policy, and what it's going to look like. Repeat Fred's apologies for those sort of over on this side of the room who will struggle to see the slides, so get a notebook of actually reading the diagram that we have got there. The slides will be available on the IFA and PAA website, also on Kensington Swan's website, run from, so if you want to access them there, then go through it all life. Won't claim any intellectual property rights over what is here. It's reasonably self-explanatory. Right, so so the long and winding road is the theme for this. Thinking with my predecessor on the chair of the Code Committee, Ross Butler, was the first one to coin the phrase of ticket to the game and talking about how you play the game. Ross was a very keen rugby man, still sort of plays veterans league type thing. I'm more into my cars, so I think about actually this is a road, we're on a road map and it's a journey that we are going down. So to go on Rob's comment earlier about are we actually clear that we're all trying to get to the same place and actually identifying what that place is going to be is quite critical to the reforms as we move forward. So I guess the long winding road, please don't start jumping out and saying, well, are we there yet? Are we there yet? The answer is no, we're still going to keep going. It really is we're never going to get there because it is an evolutionary process and we just sort of keep moving along, hopefully improving, just lifting the this game thing again, and said we're going to move away from the game, but actually look at the game as we keep going on. So it's just the nature of the beast. We do need to respond to what's happening overseas, and that was one of the sparks of prompts for the overview that kicked off last year, was the future financial advice reforms in Australia, and interestingly enough, they sort of gone around full circle and sort of unwinding reforms that first kicked us off on our own code review. So you look overseas with a little bit of caution of actually don't want to be led by what's over there. We certainly need to have regard to what's happening. Starting point for this was actually, so I guess, 10 years ago, the appointment of the Financial Intermediaries Task Force. Their terms of reference were to come up with a regime that would enhance the quality of financial information and advice provided to the public, and also assist New Zealanders in making the most of their savings. So that was a task, and those are still, I guess, valid objectives. As you, many in the room will know, we've gone through multiple iterations since the task force was created. From their recommendations, what they first came up with, the Financial Advisors Act is very different to what was envisaged then. There's still some elements, and some of those objectives are still there. The Financial Advisors Act, actually, where are we going, what are we trying to achieve under the current Act? The purpose of the FAA being to promote the sound and efficient delivery of financial advice and broking services, and to encourage public confidence in the professionalism and integrity of financial advisors and brokers. That's been a key theme or focus for us from the Code Committee of designing the rules of the Code of Professional Conduct. Is actually whatever we do needs to be aligned with that. Again, this is an evolutionary process. We'll keep working towards that, what's going to work, which means we need to respond to. Particularly say that public confidence point, I think is the challenging one, because through all these processes and go through consultation, actually getting feedback input from consumers has been a real challenge. Getting input both from the consumer bodies, but actually getting to a real person, take a legal term, the man on the platinum omnibus, is actually very challenging to actually find out what do they actually need. But that remains a challenge for us that we'll keep trying to work through. But actually, what is going to make a difference to the outcomes for New Zealanders? What's going to encourage them to engage with the financial advisory industry and have confidence in what's being provided. So, next part of this, the roadmap thing is actually, well, how are we going to get there? Presently, we've got the Financial Advisors Act. Ian's going to talk about the reforms coming up, throw some thoughts towards the end of my presentation. I guess the FAA says it's a complex framework with many moving and interrelated parts and multiple influences just driving this thing, which conceptually should be quite straightforward, but it gets to be quite complex. Now, probably no one will be able to read the bits on this. What we've got for those on the left side is translated or converted the Financial Advisors Act, say, with a car. That's not actually Rob Everett, although there is a bit of a resemblance, I guess. Anyway, I guess the driver, and by no coincidence, actually put, I guess, the arrows going around this of the moving parts, which is how I see that all fitting. So we actually do see the FMA actually are driving this thing, of actually pointing at the direction of where we're going. That is, I guess, is the key part for FMA. We look at this, is driving, influencing actually where we're going. But actually the directional piece that we're going to get there really is Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, which obviously Ian is our representative there to talk further about how the FAA is going to go with our Ministry of Commerce on their driving. Quite deliberately, if the wheels fall off this thing for you, so if you get it wrong, then you're going to go down to the Financial Advisors Disciplinary Committee, who've been had very limited involvement, which is a good thing today in terms of actually complaints referred through to them. And also our dispute resolution scheme sitting there. Underpinning this, the Financial Advisors Act, we've got the Financial Service Providers Register and the Registration Act, which of course we all need to register. This is something that underpins this. Sitting behind the car, and actually probably what we need to drag along on the journey are both consumers and financial advisors industry are actually key components that they still need to be with the car at the end of the day we get there. Because they will actually be the ones providing the baggage that we need to get to the destination, both good baggage and some bad baggage. But it all needs to get there at the end. There's no point in having an end game of utopia where we're going to in the map if actually we've lost all the consumers along the way and there are no participants in the industry because we've made it too hard. So it is a key factor we need to deal with. When we're setting the competency framework, and this is the point that Rob picked up on before, actually the overseas developments of moving towards tertiary qualification, potentially in Australia, where they're looking at, and like that's where they're going, is where's the code committee looking at setting the competency standards to look at. It's actually we will provide or receive input from skills as the designated industry sort of ITO in the space, designing, developing the rules of the qualifications that we need to look at. So they'll continue to play a key role, I think, in assisting us determine what are the appropriate levels of competency. Of course, they then interact directly with the financial advisory industry itself. And then we have the code committee. When I first, took the role, I thought, right, we're going to be right in the engine room, we'll be sitting alongside MD, sort of driving this thing and developing and framing up what it's going to look like. The other thing really we're the backseat driver, sort of sitting there just giving a bit of a steer, sort of talking to FMA about that. But the code committee does design the rules, influences the direction that we're going, but really we're just there, appointed by FMA in terms of the role, but independent, separate from FMA in terms of what we do. So, the Financial Advisors Act and the Code Committee, just explaining a bit where we fit in. So our functions are producing the code that gets approved by FMA and through the Ministry of Commerce. We are required to review the code from time to time, which we do, and then recommend changes. Whilst probably you might just see a bit of input when we come out for consultation on revisions to the code, the committee does meet from time to time and not monthly or even bi-monthly, quarterly, just as and when required. We gather information from FMA and decide when do we need to kick off another review of the code to adjust how we satisfy this working well, and then engaging with FMA to say we'll actually have you applying the code as we have to visit any unintended outcomes of the rules that we have proposed. We've already seen a couple of developments in that regard, say in relation to the old code standard 6D and installing guidelines, and that was really an engagement between Code Committee and FMA, taking feedback from the industry of actually working out how do we make this thing work better. Membership of the Code Committee, 7 to 11 members, one who actually represents or has come from their knowledge, competency in relation to consumer affairs. The current member of the Code Committee playing that role is David Russell, head of Consumer NZ. And then we are required to have 6 to 10 individuals qualified by virtue of their individual knowledge of and experience and competency in relation to the financial advisory industry. So that's the make-up, so just take it from industry, but we then to drive something that is going to work for industry and achieve the outcomes of the Act. Code itself required to provide for minimum standards of professional conduct for AFAs, including competence, knowledge and skills, ethical behaviour, client care, and continuing professional training. With the Financial Advice Act itself providing baseline conduct standards that all financial advisors need to comply with. I think that's a very useful feature of the Act, that actually irrespective of whether you're RFA, AFA, QFE advisor, whatever, we do have a Section 33 baseline conduct of care, diligence and skill. It sits there underpinning a lot. We don't need to repeat that in the Code of Conduct itself, but the Code of Conduct does influence what might be regarded as appropriate or what's a baseline standard for reasonable care, diligence and skill. Areas of focus for us, I guess what we're looking at, or where we see the tension points that we do look at from the code side, competency requirements that we have looked at. I think with the changes to the Financial Markets Conduct Act in particular, we do need to revisit that and just keep an eye on that, recognising that we are probably over time looking to probably raise that entry level of competency, which then raises challenges for us grandparenting existing advisors have actually recognised the tension that we need to strike a balance of actually looking for that Goldilocks position of the qualifications, something that's not too heavy, not too light, it's actually going to work and be consistent with the objectives of the Act, making sure it's going to encourage public confidence and professionalism and integrity of financial advisors, saying yes, I think we're going to appropriately qualified person there. But equally, there's still got to be advisors who are able to satisfy that standard, able and willing to participate in the industry to then deliver that advice. So I think it is a constant challenge. One of the questions is just how fast the track do we go on? Do we try and move to, say, tertiary qualification next year, which might be a little bit too soon, or is this actually a very long track we might be going towards, if in fact that is where we think we should land? There are a huge variety of advisors and advisory practices and consumer needs that are all caught up in the Financial Advisors Act. I think one of the challenge that we do have with this environment is just the sheer breadth of what is captured within the Act, and you can't really design a one-size-fits-all competency requirement. It's actually, there are these differing layers of what is appropriate, what is required. Hence why with the code we have placed a lot of reliance on this principle-based approach, client first, underpinning everything, and then also code standard 14 to need to have the confidence, skill, etc. to deliver what it is that you're providing, which is a nice little cop-out bit of the past detail there that actually code standard 14 drives what is appropriate. It actually provides some levers to increasing levels of competency still required for particular high-end levels of financial advice, like the pointy-head stuff, whilst still having a reasonable baseline of competency that somebody must satisfy to actually get in the car to start with. So I've got to get in the car as opposed to get to the games. It's good because I'll keep this terminology thinking through. The other one we're looking at is the client care obligations, which is a balancing act of making sure that consumers have an adequate level of protection, but without producing undue barriers to the provision of advice, drowning both the advisors and the consumers in paperwork. There has been feedback that we have had. There is a concern from the industry the amount of red tape, also negative feedback from consumers about the amount of paperwork and information that is being spat at them. Is this actually helping us move forward? So again, trying to find that sweet spot of actually what is the right level without exposing consumers to undue risk, while still enabling the efficient delivery of financial advice. CPD requirements, I'm quite pleased with where we got to with the last iteration of the code, hopefully providing CPD that is actually meaningful, targeted for the individual, but also flexible enough that it should be accessible for all to attain without causing anyone to undertake inappropriate or unnecessary CPD just for the sake of ticking the box and getting the hours. Underpinning it all, I think that client first paramountcy does sit within it. I see that as being a continuing feature of the code moving forward. My thoughts to change that. Where I think we've had some constraints or just challenges with what we can do with the code, I think Rob mentioned it in his presentation, just about this whole registered financial advisor, AFA, QFE advisor distinction. Just those different thresholds do make it a challenge to impact on what we are prepared to do at the code committee side in terms of setting professional conduct rules for AFAs, because if the gap becomes too big, then you create too much an incentive for perhaps people to go into the RFA less regulated route. So whilst still actually we're going to be lifting the game a bit for AFAs, I think that really only becomes possible if we're also lifting the game a bit for the RFA space. So that was something I think I'd like to see as part of the review of Financial Advisors Act come through. Maybe Ian will share some thoughts on that moving forward. DIMS has been a complication, a distraction for many. I think in the minute I've got left to remind a little bit, we can talk too much about DIMS, but do recognise this as a challenge of dealing with it. And the code itself really is very non-specific on DIMS. We're just saying, well, we've got a general set of obligations for people who are operating in that space. Whether there are any AFAs who actually jump in and say, I'm going to provide personalised DIMS moving forward, remains to be seen. There's definitely some challenges there for AFAs. We may need to respond specifically with the code depending on how that unrolls, how many actual AFAs do we have in that space, maybe dictate whether we devise specific code responses to that. The compliance burden, as I said before, is a concern of just trying to strike a balance and actually provide options for providing scaled advice. We had a crack at it in the last consultation review for the code, Suspect that will come up the next time around of actually how do we get the sweet spot for supporting scale advice at an appropriate level of obligation and due diligence for the AFA to undertake in delivering advice. We are also concerned with those in terms of aspects that do influence us, the viability of business models. It is actually part of this. We need to ensure there is actually a healthy financial advisory industry with willing to compliant participants there, where it's not too hard, where your main job is not actually just complying with regulatory requirements, but you're actually delivering financial advice first and foremost with the regulatory, but just a small component of your business underpinning it. And also making sure that nothing we do impacts on consumer access to personalised advice that has been anecdotal concern coming through. Conscious of the Code Committee, whatever we do, if it reduces consumer access to personalised advice, then that is a poor outcome. So we need to manage that very carefully to make sure that where we do end up limiting consumer access to personalised advice, because there is a clear risk that we are managing there, that is a concern. That's it from me. You met Beal Songs, so don't keep me waiting here. I think we do need to move forward with the legislation. Look at the framework. Actually, thank the FAA, we've got to as a good start. We were completely unregulated space, but this is a journey. We're going from, say, Auckland down to Wellington. We're possibly only about Hamilton now, and there are a number of ways that we can get to Wellington. We'll see how that might go. Thank you for your attention. Look forward to questions later on.
Yeah, thanks, David. And certainly, as we got towards the end with 1 minute to go, to cover dinners would have been a challenge. I'm sure there'll be some questions on that. And to our people on the far left here, in regards to the overhead code handbrakes and driver distractions, which you may not have viewed all that clearly in the car, that was actually David Ross's wife. So, Ian Southall was our final speaker for the policy process. Ian.
Fred. I might try and keep going with the car analogy and maybe start by saying I slightly disagree with you, David. I don't think we're in Hamilton. I think we're a little bit further south than that. But I do agree with you that we're in, I think we are in a much better place than we were. But I think it's fair to say that the ministry has been starting to turn our mind to this financial advisor Act review, and to use your analogy, I think we'd like to think that this is the start of the journey for this review, and we had a talk at the Infants Conference last Thursday, I think it was, so we are trying to get out and about and talk to as many people as possible, so I think that would be the flavour of the talk that I'm going to try and give today, which is about the start of the journey and where we end up as a long winding road. I think we are in a good space where we can do it a little bit better. I mean, one of the most heartening things about this afternoon is the amount of people that are here. When we met up with Fred a month ago or so, he was sort of thinking we might get sort of, the order of 100 or 150 people at this gig. But just looking out here, it must be closer to 250, 300 people, which is great. But one thing I want to stress, I think, one of the things I do want to stress is that I don't think we want this to be the only interaction with you guys. I think we really need to take some of the lessons from the Ministry's interaction, particularly on the Financial Markets Conduct Act work, where we have an ongoing dialogue with you guys. So I think this provides us a valuable opportunity to start this conversation, and I know the title of the conference is a conversation with the policy setters, and hopefully we can continue that conversation to make it constructive, productive, and, as I say, really importantly, ongoing. As I say, the promotional materials call this a conversation with the policy setters. So I think Dave's done a really good job, even those who probably can't see the diagram, of trying to explain where we all fit into the process. And I had a look at David's slide during the week, and it did strike me that it is a little bit confusing. And that's even for me who's involved in this stuff. So I thought I'd maybe just give a little bit of a flavour of how I and the ministry fits into the equation, and maybe talk a little bit about the process going forward, and then maybe pick up a couple of the points that we've heard from David and Rob. I think the point that David was making about who is driving the car, or who is the ultimate decision maker, is an important one to reference. We in the ministry report to the new Minister for Commerce and Consumer Affairs. So Minister Goldsmith has been in place for approximately a month now. So it's fair to say he hasn't quite turned his mind to this particular review, but I think he's done a great job so far in his first month of actually getting out and talking to a number of financial market participants. I know there's a few of you that he's already met, and I think he is fully aware of the desire for us to pick this review up and to improve the legislation. Now, I guess the way that we sometimes try to think about in the ministry about what our role is I'm trying to maybe characterise it like for you guys, is that we are similar in roles like you, in that we've got a client who we need to make sure has the right information in front of him or her to make those decisions. So I guess that's what our role is, working with the FMA and the Code Committee, you guys, and the consumers of financial products, to make sure that we can try and get the information in front of the minister at the appropriate time and with the data to back our recommendations up. So one of our key drivers, and one of the reasons why we are coming to events like this and hopefully reaching out, is to try and get as much data as possible so that we can provide the minister with the information. I think he will be someone who will test us quite a lot around the regulation. I think he has heard some of the issues that David and Rob have mentioned, and I'm sure there are others. But what our aim would be from this review, we didn't chat beforehand, Rob, but I should reassure you, we also think it should be a comprehensive review. I just can't see any other way to do it. I think if we tweaked some things, I think there would be a real danger that we go off track and crash the car, potentially even worse than it is at the moment. So I think that a comprehensive review is something that we, the ministry, are very much in favour of. We haven't specifically talked to the minister about the review, but I can't see him disagreeing with that. So our aim will be to have a look at the range of options available to him. We obviously do have the statutory obligation to carry out the review, but there possibly are non-legislative options that we might also want to think about. We've got to work with you guys and the regulators and consumers to make sure we're informed of all the potential costs and benefits of different options. And then importantly, we've got to fully advise him of the risks of any of the changes. So like you guys, following our advisory role that is our role. So as I said, one of the key things that we will be thinking about is the information that we can gather, and you guys are a key stakeholder in ensuring that we get the information required. So we will be coming and having a bit of a chat. I think a couple of my colleagues have been in touch with a couple of industry bodies to set up meetings for the next wee while, but I'd like to emphasise that we want to reach out and hear from you about the issues that you've got. As I mentioned, one of the things that I think we've been reflecting on in the ministry is what's gone well, particularly with the Financial Markets Conduct Act and the level of interaction we've had with the financial services industry in that process. We'd like to think that the reason that we've got a regime that's coming into force shortly, which is in pretty good nick, is in no small measure to the level of engagement that you guys have given us on that particular topic. And I think it would be remiss of us not to take forward the lessons from that and build on that. That particular act, as I'm sure you're all aware, has the genesis of the Capital Markets Development Task Force, which was the kind of follow-up to the Intermediaries Task Force, which David mentioned. And that collaborative approach on the FMC, I think, has got us to a spot where we like to think that it's pretty close to that sweet spot that David was referring to as well. Now, I think it's fair to say that we are aware that the process for the financial advisors regime was perhaps not as consultative and open and transparent as it perhaps should have been, and as has been the case with the FMC. So, and I know we've got data to back this up in our baseline review that we did in 2011, 2012. There was quite a high percentage of the financial advisor community who did make reference to the difficulty they had in working out where the regime was heading, who to talk to, how to ensure that their voice was being heard. So that is something that we are wanting to. We think we can do a lot better, and I'd like to hope that you guys can work with us to ensure that we can continue to do that. Just on process, as discussed, there is a 5-year statutory review in the legislation, so that means that we are required by Parliament to report to the Minister by July 2016 on the review of the Financial Advisors Act. Now, that's actually, we think if we think of this as a start of the journey, we think that gives us quite a bit more time than we're used to in some policy processes to actually spend a bit of time working with key stakeholders on the panel and in front of us to work out what the options are around the process and our objectives. Now we are aware that there has been quite a lot of consultation